He's Barack Obama's first biographer, but journalist David Mendell doesn't expect his 2007 book to land a spot in Obama's presidential library.
Probably the big thing is Michelle didn't care for it because, I wrote about their marriage.
I'm Charlie Meyerson. Wherever you live, odds are good your town is filled with fascinating people who have great stories to tell. I'm lucky enough the newspaper publisher in my town, Oak Park, Illinois, the Wednesday Journal, invites me to host on-stage conversations with some of the fascinating people who live or have lived here. This time out, it's Dave Mendell, one of my former colleagues at another newspaper, the Chicago Tribune. We barely exchanged hellos back then, though, because he was so involved in the stories you're about to hear. His time covering Obama's ascendance to the U.S. Senate. His rise, as Dave's book title puts it, from promise to power. So sit back and listen as we all learn more about Dave's adventures, including why Mrs. Obama isn't so crazy about the book. Here's the way it went November 20th, 2019 at Dominican University in River Forest.
I aim not to read the books of authors that I interview because I see myself as an advocate for the audience members who, in many cases, may also not have read the book. It's easy to go down the rabbit hole. On page 27, you say this. In this case, I had an extra incentive not to read your book, Dave, partly because you and I lived some of it together in our time at the Chicago Tribune, partly because I just didn't have the stomach to read now in 2019 about a promising and intelligent young politician's rise to power because, well, you know. But, darn it, once I started, I couldn't stop.
That was my goal.
And so here we are. Take us back, if you would, to your first encounter with a relatively young Barack Obama, around 2000, right?
Right. The first time I encountered him, I was just working a weekend shift at the Tribune, and I hadn't been assigned to him in any depth. He was running against Bobby Rush, and that was a pretty ill-fated experience for him. And I had to go to it was in Hyde Park. He was running against Rush for Congress, and he held a press conference about prescription drug, he was unveiling his prescription drug proposal. And it did not go so well for him because this is meant when his campaign was plummeting and he was under criticism for staying in Hawaii during his, every December, he and Michelle and the family would go to Hawaii. And there was a bill before the state Senate, the Safe Neighborhoods Act, that was a huge gun control measure, and it was touch and go whether it would pass, and it lost by about 4 votes. And Obama was in Hawaii and did not cast a vote. So he was, the Tribune editorial board, everybody was coming at him. And so we get to the press conference, and nobody asked him one question about the health care bill, and he just looked like a failing politician. He was dying on stage with every question, and I thought he handled the fallout as best he could, but at that point, he didn't look like a guy who was going anywhere. He was on the way out, if anything. He still was a very active state senator, but here was his big moment to try to go to Congress, and he picked the wrong race, and that was my first encounter with him. So it wasn't like I saw this guy and said, "Oh, he's going somewhere." It was more, it was quite the opposite.
The summer of 2003, you were trying to avoid an assignment that, in retrospect, would change your life.
Oh, yeah. I did not want to cover the Democratic Senate race. I did everything I could to try. Not the way the Tribune was structured, I was a general assignment reporter, and I was a very capable guy. I thought I was on the rise, and I
can attest to that.
And I was. They liked me, and I wanted to write about urban affairs, but and I was working my way in that area to write about poverty and the neighborhoods in Chicago. They just fascinated me. But Rick Pearson, who was the political editor, they figured out that I knew a little bit about politics. I'd covered politics in Ohio. And so they needed somebody to cover this Senate race that it had all these candidates in it. And I just said, oh my God, this is a dog of an assignment. This is the worst thing ever. I'm going to have to do a profile on all 5 of these people, and it's the Senate race. It's not the mayor's race. It's not the governor's race. I'm never going to be near the front page. But if I screw up and I get beat on something by one of the other publications, it's going to look bad on me. So I said, there's no upside and a big downside to this assignment. Plus, writing 5 profiles, and these candidates are working at night and on weekends. I had a young family. I'm never going to see my family. So I did everything I could to avoid this. I would jump behind, I'd see Rick Pearson and I would jump behind a Coke machine, thinking maybe he will forget I exist. But no such luck. When the memo came out of who's assigned where, and I was stuck with it. But it's one of those things in life that you think is terrible for you, but actually works out in your favor.
How did your impressions of Barack Obama evolve from those first encounters until your latest encounter?
Well, we had the strangest relationship. I mean, he was what I would say. He was my lab rat. He was my subject. I was constantly following this guy around and watching his every move, and listening to everything he had to say. And who wants somebody tailing them around, listening to everything they have to say? So we had a relationship that probably wasn't healthy. And I tried to manage it as best I could, but my job, I said, I would say my job is to follow you everywhere you go. And he would shake his head and say, okay. And but my first impressions of him, I knew his resume. I knew he was a highly intelligent guy, and that was clear from the get-go that he was a very well-studied, prepared. There's nobody more disciplined that I've ever met than Obama. But it was a different relationship than any 2 people could possibly have. I remember we were out on the campaign trail once in southern Illinois, and there I said, this guy is so tired of seeing me. I am just going to melt into the background for 2 days. He is not going to see me at all. And this was when he was running for the U.S. Senate, and things were going his way, but he was on this but Michelle was not at all happy with him because he had been running for office for the last 3 years or so. So I said, he's not going to see me for the next 2 days. I'm going to be following him around. So we're in Quincy, I think it was Quincy, and the river is in the background, and he's giving a speech, and before he's about to give a speech before everybody, and Michelle is there. And so I say, I'm going to stand behind them about 15 feet, and so they don't see me, and he's got his arm around Michelle, and he's trying to, just be affectionate toward her, and she was having none of it. She was mad at him. She didn't want to be on this trip, and it's for whatever reason he decides I'm going to look behind me to see who might be watching me touch my wife on the side or on the back side, and he turns backward, and there I am. How you doing? And this, I know he had to think in that moment, can I not go anywhere where this guy isn't there? So, I don't know if I answered your question, but when I think of Obama and my impressions of him are so solid, but I think of the strange relationship that he and I had as biographer, subject, and candidate.
Well, reading your book, I kept thinking of Cameron Crowe's autobiographical movie, Almost Famous.
Great movie. Yeah.
Well, and it's about journalism in a lot of ways. What is life like for reporters who are attached so intimately to a candidate that it can feel like you're a member of the band, but the band views you, as Cameron Crowe put it, as the enemy.
Well, the band didn't view me as the enemy until my book came out. Then, then I was the enemy because I wrote things that they didn't, that they weren't completely comfortable with.
But it was the book, but not the reporting along the way to the book.
Oh, we had our disputes along the way. I wrote a piece on a Sunday when Obama traveled to Iowa, and he gave a really poor speech, and he knew it, and everyone around him knew it. The Iowa, they just ate him up. He was at this point where he could recite a nursery rhyme, and people were infatuated with him. And I wrote a piece in the Sunday perspective section that said maybe this guy needs a little more seasoning if he's actually going to look for higher office. And he didn't take well to it. And next time I saw him, he said, "You're taking all these jabs at me in the newspaper." So there were, there's a tension there. But my job wasn't to be, his best friend, and it wasn't to be his, advisor. It was to analyze and tell the public who this guy is. What was fortunate, I think, where we lose this a little bit today, because I don't think we have as many reporters with those kind of relationships with candidates or with athletes or whoever is they're so cut off from us, even in the last 10 years. But I got a pretty good sense of, I think, who the guy really was by, being right there all the time.
Is it hard not to feel like you are a member of the team and not to, for instance, offer feedback or advice along the way before you write your story or complete your book?
Sure. I mean, there were times I knew more than the aides did, and that was problematic. At the beginning, Obama could not, he was terrible at giving a speech that was written for him. He just would, it sounded like he was reading something, and typically he was very bored with it. And so I remember the first time Robert Gibbs came in, all of a sudden Washington showed up. He had all these local people, and then he won the primary in Illinois, and then all these Washington people joined the campaign because he's running for the U.S. Senate, and they don't want to lose this office. They sent some good people, some good Washington hands to come work for him, even though I remember him saying, "Oh, this campaign is not going to go Washington, not going to go Washington at all." And then, sure enough, I said, "Who are all these Washington people around?" All of a sudden, even he was sort of naive as to what was coming. But he's reading this speech, and it's just terrible. He's got the audience falling asleep. And afterward, Robert Gibbs sidles up to me, and I said, "As you can see, he doesn't read other people's work very well. You should just hand him notes." And just because he speaks so well, by himself. So I guess, I'm offering a tip, but not that Gibbs wasn't going to figure that out, because he was like, I thought I had this great star, and this guy just, laid an egg delivering, trying to give this speech. He just wasn't good at reading somebody else. I think half the time he was reading it and saying, "Boy, I would never write this. This is just terrible. Why would I write this? Why am I reading this?" And so it was better off. And I remember Gibbs said, "Yeah, I think I'm just going to let him write his own speeches from now on." And I said, "You're probably better off that way." So.
A number of people, you've mentioned a couple so far, with supporting roles in this story of Barack Obama, Rahm Emanuel is in your book, have become increasingly prominent since then. David Axelrod, another guest in this series. Whose arc of all of those supporting characters has surprised you the most?
Tommy Vitor. Anybody know Pod Save America? Anybody? It's a podcast.
The audience nods.
Yeah, sort of. Well, it's a huge podcast on the left. Tommy Vitor was just this young kid who was just trying to. He had been kicked. The Edwards campaign imploded, and so he was sort of a castaway. So they put him over on Obama's campaign. He became my driver, essentially. They decided, we shouldn't have this reporter sitting next to our candidate, because I was in the back seat all the time until he till he won the primary. I was just the guy sitting in the back seat, and I would hear his phone calls with his wife, and
Just to clarify, we're talking about the Senate primary.
Senate primary, not the presidency. No, that was a completely different beast. But Vitor was just this kid who, but he wound up being spokesman for, I think it wasn't the Homeland Security, but one of the major departments he wanted. And it was sort of like seeing your little brother, get this huge job, and you still see him as like your little runt brother. And so Tommy's done very well for himself.
You write at length about a speech that, at least at one point, Obama considered one of his best, 2002 address about the U.S. invasion of Iraq. What made that so significant?
Well, that was the gift that kept on giving to Obama, and there was a lot of pushback on what I wrote about that. How I wrote about that. If you take yourself all the way back, we're about to invade Iraq, and Obama gets a call from Betty Lou Saltzman, who was a very prominent fundraiser, liberal fundraiser in the city, and she says, I want you to speak at this anti-war rally. We're going to have an anti-war rally. And Obama, she said, she'd known him privately and donated to his campaigns, and she knew he was very anti-war. So she calls him and asks for him to speak, and he has to decide, am I going to give this speech or not? And he dawdled a few days on it, and I wrote about the fact that he didn't know whether he should do it politically, take a stand against the war, or not. And when he was running for the presidency, Axelrod challenged my reporting on it and said he was from the beginning, because they didn't want him to seem like he ever thought maybe I shouldn't come out against the war. I was always in favor of it, because that was the thing that distinguished him from Hillary. And that was, in my opinion, there wasn't anything that helped him more than that speech. He came out and he gave it was a terrific speech. He said, this is the wrong war. He said, I'm not a pacifist. And it was, to me, it was also a bit of a brave speech, because he was talking to a group of folks who were there a lot of pacifists in the audience who just didn't believe in any war. And he said, he says, there are some wars we need to fight, but this is the wrong one. And so when my book came out and I reported that, the reporting was that he had thought about this as a political calculation, and some of his advisors told him, look, you have to go give this speech because you need to win the liberals, and you can't tick off Betty Lou Saltzman, who's a huge backer of yours. So he decided politically it was the right move, but he also believed in what he said. He didn't disbelieve what he was saying. So there was a lot of pushback because they were worried that he needed to look pure and clean as the anti-war guy, and he didn't need to look like he was a politician making a decision. Is this going to help me? Is this not going to help me? And so there was a lot of pushback after that.
You made the point that speech, I believe, came to fit, or perhaps already fit, a pattern that Obama would use in many of his speeches.
That was what impressed you as a journalist, because he didn't always play to the crowd. There were times he'd be downstate and he would always mention God, which was a good thing to do in a speech to folks downstate. But he would sometimes mention gay rights or something, and it made me feel watching him that he had a little bit of courage that maybe some other politicians didn't have, and he had a sense of, he seemed more authentic at times, that he would actually give you an opinion that maybe not everybody in the crowd agreed with, but he was so masterful at giving that opinion and not alienating the other side, and that's making it seem like, well, this is what I feel. You may be right, but this is what I feel. It was his message, And, Americans were looking for that at that point in time. That was the kind of guy that really played well when he hit the national stage.
You lift the curtain at one point on Obama's inner dialogue in a scene that I was gripped by, where you ask him what he thought of then Mayor Daley's well over budget plans for Chicago's Millennium Park. And he answers, "If I told you how I really felt, I'd be committing political suicide right in front of you." What did that encounter say about Obama and ultimately his career?
Well, what it said in the moment was, hey, he said that off the record, too, by the way. He said, look, off the record, if I give you what I really feel about this.
Well, how did it get on the record then?
I talked to him later, and I said, look, some of the things that we've said, are going to make it into my book. You realize that. And I said, when you're running for president, sometimes the off-the-record stuff isn't off the record. And there were no negotiations that went over. I just told him that, and I'm sure there are a few things, probably that one, he wasn't crazy about. But I didn't have. It was one of those where he said off the record, but I didn't agree to it either. I mean, usually you have to have a given choice. He said off the record, and then he said it.
I derailed you though. So what did that
tell
you about him?
What it said is that he, it told you that he was. At that point, I realized he was a savvy politician. You didn't know where he was going. He was running fourth or fifth in that Senate race at that point. And I could tell, and it told me that, he didn't want to lie to me. He didn't want to give me some staged answer, but he didn't want to insult my intelligence and give me some, so for me, it was it was very polished that he could make he was trying to make some sort of connection in that way. But then he did give me the staged answer after that, which was something like, look, I have a huge district and the mayor has to dole out money to, I would love to have that money in my district for there's people really hurting in my district, but the city has its priorities and that kind of thing. But my question, it was a very good question because it was a killer. The answer was going to be difficult. And I said, look, you've been talking to me for the last 15 minutes about the underprivileged in your district and how you weep for the children who don't have enough, who are underprivileged and aren't getting enough resources, and you can't bring resources. I said, but you look out the window, we're building a $500 million park, and this is your district. I said, how do you square those two things? Wouldn't you like some of that money into your district, and why don't you speak out against the mayor, I think is how I put it. And he said, well, that would be political suicide.
How much of a problem, in your estimation, over the course of his career, was or is Obama's willingness to be honest on occasion?
He certainly was more deft as when he ran for president. He wasn't. I don't think he was dishonest in his campaign, but there were moments where he said things that were uncomfortable. I think gay rights, for instance. I think he ardently believed in gay rights, but he didn't want to go that far with it. He didn't want to lose certain segments of Middle America. He could have been much stronger on that issue, and I know that he probably felt much stronger on that issue. So I think his honesty. I mean, I found him in personal situations with me to be, exceptionally honest. I didn't find the guy lying to me really much on anything. His aides would. His aides would, there was an instance where I wrote a piece about how he sent out a mailer on his state senate stationery, it was purely printed up on a state senate paperwork, and it shouldn't go out on that. It should be, it should be from your campaign. And he got he calls me up, and I remember I'm driving down the Eisenhower. And I'm on a stick shift trying to talk to him, and I'm driving, managing the stick shift, had a cup of coffee and trying to talk to him. And I said, look, this thing violates the spirit of the law. And he said, well, how do you mean that? You know, I don't. You're just trying to take a shot at me in the paper. And I said, no. I said, I didn't say it. You violated the law. I said, I did everything above board. It was legal. And I said, well, yeah, but it sort of violates the spirit of a law that, in fact, he had written, where you can't send out this campaign literature within 2 weeks of a filing period or something like that. And so he eventually says, well, you know what? You're right. He said, you're right about that. I don't know why those guys sent that out at this time. He said, the campaign screwed up. So then I get Axelrod calling me up like 2 hours later, all over me about the story. And I said, well, your guy just admitted 2 hours ago that you guys screwed up. He said, what? I said, do you want me to read the quote to you? He said, you're right. He said, you know, I shouldn't have done this. He said, oh. And I said, it sounds like you've got an honest guy on your hands here. And he said, yeah, sometimes that's a real problem, too.
One of the recurring themes in your narrative is Obama's appeal to women and the tension that created in his life.
Oh, yeah. Michelle was none too pleased that he would go to the East Bank Club and work out. I mean, at some point, when he won the primary and he blew up he was starting to blow up around Illinois as he would around the world, and he became this sex symbol to women. I mean, he would go to events and he would complain that he would get so squeezed in and women would be touching him and grabbing him in places that he didn't really care to be grabbed. And it got back to Michelle that he was at the East Bank Club, and 2 women had said, let's go watch Barack Obama work out. And this got back to her, and she was none too pleased. She was thinking, what is this? You know, I know my husband is in politics, but I didn't think it would, you know, I didn't think it would happen. It would turn into this. And so we were on the campaign trail once, and there was she hops in the car. She's none too pleased that day. The poor guy's going, you know, had to. He was constantly juggling this family career thing. Not that a lot of us haven't run into that, but here was this guy who's all of a sudden shot out on out of a cannon, and he becomes this huge star, and he's got to tend to that. But yet he's got this family at home with 2 little girls and a wife who's never seeing him. So he had to manage that, and it wasn't always pretty the way he did it. And I think Michelle writes about that in her book, that, you know, they went to counseling for a time. And anyway, we're on this event, and I get in the back of the vehicle, and she sits down, and she has this political cartoon in her hand, and it said, married. It said married Carrie, lust for Obama. And she was, you know, she said, this is what I have to contend with on a daily basis, and just drops it down. And so he was constantly, you know, while he's Mr. Calm, Cool, Collected, and performed so well in public, he did have this turmoil. I don't want to say turmoil, because Michelle was supportive of him in a million ways, but he did have this tension in this part of his life as he became more and more famous, and he had to manage that and also manage a campaign and try to keep his career moving forward. So it was and here I am, you know, knowing all of this and a little too close to it. So probably for everybody's sake.
Speaking of too close, another subplot is Obama's struggle with tobacco. What did you know, and when did you know it?
Yeah, this is the thing that he is most embarrassed about, and his tobacco addiction and his smoking addiction is the thing that he tried to hide from everybody. I mean, we've got a president now who's tried to hide. I don't know if he's tried to hide having dalliances with porn stars, but so this seems like nothing, you know, the fact that the guy smokes. But to him, it was a great sign of weakness, his own weakness. He tried to kick the habit, never was able to do it. But I knew early on that he was a smoker, because I got in the car They actually came by Oak Park here, and they were campaigning somewhere around here, and his driver grabbed me, and I went with him for the rest of the day, and I got in the car, and Obama wasn't in the car, and it smelled like smoke. And I said to the driver, Mike, I said, Mike, do you smoke? Mike says, no. I said, okay. So you're around a smoker, you know, they can't hide it much. But it was very difficult, because I also learned that he didn't want, one reason he didn't want me around was that he knew that at some point maybe I was going to have to write about this, and it was just something he didn't want to show off to the world. He tried to conceal it. It was the only thing that he really did work really hard at keeping from all of you. But I really wondered, how am I going to handle this? Because at the end of that year, I had to write a big profile about him, and certainly the fact that he smokes was part of that. And I thought, geez, how, you know, I'm going to have to out this guy smoking. Is he going to? I said, and I'm going to have to keep covering him afterward. I said, this is going to be a dicey situation. But I caught a break in that the Sun-Times did their profile a week before the Tribune, and Michelle talked to the reporter Scott Fornick for the Sun-Times and told him, and she outed him because she wanted him to quit. So her whole, she decided, I'm going to out him in public, and I'm going to shame him into giving up this awful habit that we all hate. And so she outed him the week before I did. And there's one of the smoking stories. I have others.
Give us one more.
Well, that brings me back to me back to Tommy Vitor, the little runt of a guy. We were going through the cornfields of Illinois, and Obama's in the car in front of us, and it's got to be maybe midnight or so. We'd just come from a campaign event, and his campaign staff had booked him at an event like 2 hours away, and he was really pissed off about that. We all were, because we're like, why are we driving 2 hours at this? It was a terrible scheduling. But we're driving through these cornfields, and it's really dark at night. And in front of us, Obama's in front of us, and you see these little orbs of orange fly out of the vehicle from the passenger side. And Tommy just keeps looking at me like, uh-oh, because he doesn't know that at this point Tommy was new to the campaign, and he didn't know that I knew that Obama smoked, and they were still trying to hide this. And these things are flying out, and Tommy, every time one of them flies out. And also at this point, Obama had said that he smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes on the campaign trail. Well, he was he was just chain one after another just coming out. I mean, the things are coming out, hitting the cornfield, and I'm wondering, is that one of these fields going to go up in flames? But so Tommy keeps looking at me, and I finally turn to Tommy and I say, Tommy, you know, I know that Barack smokes. And he says, oh, you do? And I said, yeah. I said, I've known it for some time. He's like, well, as long as he knows that I didn't think on him, you know, that wasn't the one who let you know this. And so that's where Tommy was, and he winds up being a big kahuna in Washington for a while. It went from being the kid who was scared to death that he was going to get in trouble by the teacher to being the spokesman for the Homeland Security Department.
What happened or didn't happen during Obama's rise to power that would have played out differently if social media had been then what it is now?
The folks on the internet, to his credit, he gave them a lot of attention early on. I remember the Daily Cause wrote a piece that was very critical of him for being too centrist, because the folks on the left were starting to learn maybe this guy isn't the flaming liberal and isn't going to change the world that we thought. So they wrote something that was, and I don't remember the substance of it or the policy matter, but it was quite critical of him. And he called up the head of the Daily Cause and talked to him and gave him as much. He treated him as seriously as he would treat the Chicago Tribune. So Obama, I think, intrinsically knew early on that the internet was a place that he needed. And this was, his aides didn't tell him to do this. And he wound up writing a piece back for them, that explained his position. These days, I don't know. He got eaten up by the birther stuff. Not eaten up, but the birther stuff that Trump pushed early on. That I'm sure that would have caught even more fire if the internet is what it is now back then. But they used the internet so skillfully. His people used it brilliantly. I mean, they put up these images of him. The speeches and weaving them into music videos and turning him into this other being for a period of time. So I don't know. I think these guys might have still been able to figure it out and still won the internet.
A little ahead of the curve.
Yes.
You have expressed second thoughts about your book's even-handed approach to Barack Obama, and I can attest that that is what it delivers. If you had any of your coverage, any of the content of the book in particular, to do differently in this political landscape in which we find ourselves now, would you have taken more of a stand? I mean, would you have been less even-handed?
No. I that was my job. I thought was to, my job in writing this book was to portray this person as in every way that I could, and in a fair manner, but also, I didn't pull any punches in the book, and of course with some hindsight as to the issues he took on, I probably would have written more about his health care, because that's an issue that obviously he grabbed onto when he got to Washington. Had I known that was going to be a signature issue in his legacy, I probably would have written a little more about what he did in the state legislature regarding that. But as far as his character and being even and even-handed with him and portraying all the characters as I did, no, I would still write it the same way. But we're at an era now where these kind of books are, my book was attacked from the pro-Obama people and from the anti-Obama people. So I figure I did a pretty good job. Both sides had issues with what I wrote. And these days, you usually see one side or the other. You don't see as much, in the middle. And so it was very hard in this atmosphere for me to be categorized. Am I a pro-Obama guy? Am I an anti-Obama guy? There was somebody on the internet, in one of Goodreads or somewhere, who said, who wrote, this David Mendell, what are his politics? I can't tell after I've read this book. And I took that as a source of pride, that, you couldn't tell. Was I for this guy or against this guy?
President Obama's relatively low profile during the Trump administration and the present Democratic presidential primary campaign has, I think it's safe to say, disappointed a lot of his fans. Is it surprising to you that that's the arc that he's followed?
No, quite frankly, Obama is such a straight line to me, and I'm one of the few people who looks at him that way. I mean, he would go up and down in polls, and people would say this and that about him, and to me, he was very much a straight line. I think he was very consistent in the policies he had, and quite frankly, I didn't think he would be a change the world president, even though he sold himself as that, and that's what disappointed a lot of people, hope and change. I always saw him as more of a cautious politician. He picks and chooses his battles, and he's very willing to negotiate and make compromises with the other side. So I'm really, no, most presidents try to stay out of the current president's business. Because their voices, can be seen as undermining whatever the present administration is doing. When you're president, you don't want the last president running you down. So it's just sort of a courtesy that presidents have with one another. So it doesn't surprise me that he has lived up and regarded that courtesy.
Have you followed the debate, the discussion over plans for the Obama Presidential Center on Chicago's South Side? What do you think of it, and do you have anything that you would donate to that center?
Yeah, but I don't think you're going to find my book there.
You were his first biographer.
But they didn't like my book. You know, I was the first guy who wrote about him in such a straight manner, and he's got his books to sell, and there are certainly books that are more pro-Obama than mine were. Mine wasn't negative, but probably the big thing is Michelle didn't care for it because, I wrote about their marriage. I wrote about, there was a point in the book in which I wrote that I thought, I was interviewing her, and I said, well, what is it like to be married to a guy who's really married to his career? And the first time I interviewed her, she was in this tiny little office at the University of Chicago, and she was working in the communications department, and I thought, this is a woman with a Harvard law degree. Well, what is she doing here? But she was the one who took the career hit for the sake of the family. Her husband, had these lofty ambitions of being a big-time politician. So they had a couple kids, and somebody had to stay home with the kids and make sure she was the rock at home, as he said. But she was, after talking with her for 10 minutes, you could tell, okay, this woman is every bit as smart as he is, and she's a little more engaging because she doesn't seem to have an agenda. She's just very down to earth, and had a very warm personality. And so, I wrote that, you took the career hit here. What's it like for, to be married to someone who is just, his career is the biggest thing in his life? And she said, well, that's what it's like for all men. All men have career and God are in there, and family is in there, but their career is first. And I said, that's just not the case. I said, there are some men who take a career hit for the sake of their family. And I don't think she cared for me analyzing their relationship in that manner. And so the word got to me that she didn't care for the book, and I don't think that that's going to get me into the Obama Foundation library anytime soon. So,
you have any advice for reporters who are now covering the thousands of candidates for the 2020 presidential nomination?
It's a totally different environment now. I mean, there's no way that for probably a guy running for that high an office of Senate that, there would have been, my deadline was every 24 hours. It wasn't every 15 minutes like it is now. He would give a speech, and I would, take it down, and I would write it for the Tribune. It would go in the paper the next day. And so there was a lot of downtime that we had, and I wasn't constantly writing every little thing that the candidate would say. So I think reporters have a much more difficult job now than they used to. They when you're constantly on deadline and every little thing is going to go out to the universe and possibly turn into something, there's a lot of pressure not to. I don't think you can. The detachment that you have to have even more detachment now, and you're not going to be as close to the. I think there's going to be more of an arm's length from the folks you're covering than ever. It used to be there was, I got to know Obama extremely well. I don't think anybody covering a certain candidate is really going to get that kind of access anymore. The Tribune doesn't put one-on-one. It doesn't have somebody rolling around with candidates anymore. They're just they're not the resources, and it's just a different environment now.
And now it's time for questions from the audience. How would you describe your relationship now with Barack Obama? One audience member asked in advance of this session.
We have no relationship.
When's the last time you talked to him?
Last time I talked to Obama was the last interview for the book, which was 2007, something like that. I've talked to the aides. I've talked to his aides, but he was running for president. He was a little busy, and I wasn't. And then he became president, and he was a little busy. So I wasn't. I was the past. He dealt with me. I didn't go off to Washington and continue to cover him, and we didn't continue to interact. So there's been our relationship non-existent.
Do you have any insight as to whether eventually President Obama made the kind of connections that he initially had trouble making with African American men in particular on Chicago's west and south sides?
Yeah, that was something that was really fascinating to watch because Obama was black, but he didn't grow up in an African American environment. So the audience that he had probably the most difficulty with were African Americans and African American males in particular. He didn't always. I think he felt like he didn't have the street cred. I think he probably does now because he's represented them and he became their demigod for a long time. But for a while, he wasn't as comfortable with people as he learned to be in one-on-one situations. He would slap, a black guy in the back, say, "Hey, brother, how's it going?" And it was just a little too much. It was like a white guy from Harvard trying to be down, and I would be taking notes about all that. But Michelle's world was sort of the upper crust, elite African American community in Chicago. So he did struggle to connect, I think, with some black males of less intellectual or less educational ability, not ability, but less education. So, but he had trouble connecting sometimes with anybody who was a common person. He was Harvard, and as David Axelrod said, he became a much better candidate when he stopped thinking that every debate and every public appearance he had was he was taking orals at Harvard. He went in and tried to show everybody how smart he was, and that isn't going to win you votes. Showing everybody, you want to connect with people at their level, and but he was such a quick study. He picked up on that, and by the time he was running for president, that was non-existent anymore.
If you could write a book about another U.S. politician, living or dead, who would you choose? About whom would you choose to write?
Living or dead? Well, there have been so many books written about the dead. I know who who in the Democratic fold would be a fascinating person. Buttigieg would be, if he comes out of this, would be an extraordinarily interesting guy to write about. A gay mayor in South Bend, Indiana. Just that world in and of itself, how he manages that world and how it shows how we've changed as a society. I think he would be a great guy to write, and his life is still evolving. It's not done, and I think it'd be very hard if you're writing about somebody who's dead and. They're
not as responsive to questions.
They're not at all. And I'm a reporter at heart. I'm not an observer. And that was what I think was what I tried to bring to this project with this book, was that I was there seeing all this. And that's what the strength of the book is. At some point, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, and I was talking with David Remnick, who wound up writing his own Obama book. And I said, my editor at the beginning did not want me to write this first person. And I said, we kind of thought about it. He said, it's kind of jarring that you keep appearing. And I said, well, look, this is like, Tuesdays with Barack, this is what I bring to the story. And I think that I think I have to write it in that way. And Remnick said, you were correct in writing it in that way. And that was, he's a guy who knows, the editor of the New Yorker, written about a dozen books. He knows a little bit about writing, so.
My opinion doesn't carry anywhere near as much weight, but I agree. This isn't exactly a question, but it did come in from someone who submitted it in advance. Let me know what you think. This is in response to a New York Times headline. Obama says average American doesn't want to tear down system. The comment was, Barry, I love you, man. Like, for real. You were the man for the time, and you rocked it, but you are wrong. We loved your centrism in a post-Bush era, but now we want more. I don't like the progressives who deride you, but we want more. Much, much more. Thanks, though, for being a very respectable president. Comments?
That's sort of a left-handed compliment to him, right? Well, he may not, if he were in this election cycle, he may not be the guy. And if he is the guy, he would probably have to tilt a little bit to the left, farther than he was. I mean, but if you remember, he was to the left of Hillary, or perceived to be to the left of Hillary. He's just a very cautious guy, and what I think is that he's afraid that the next Democrat will put up somebody who isn't palpable to, or isn't can't the middle America won't vote for. I think he's afraid that Elizabeth Warren won't be, that 10% in the middle, that she could shock them, some of her plans, and there's a little bit too much socialism involved. And so, he's a politician, and once politicians get in office, one thing they learn is that it's hard to win. You have to go through a lot to win. And once you get in there, then it's hard to govern. But first you have to win. And you have to be the right person, the right candidate at the right time. And so they tend to be very cautious and when it comes to taking a stand. That doesn't surprise. I mean, he's a guy who believes, you got to win first. You got to win the game first before you can play in the game. And he's, he made that comment because he wants either Deval Patrick or Joe Biden to win. They're his buddies. It could be that. There could be something behind the scenes, but I just think he's worried that the Democrats will put up somebody too far to the left and wind up somehow losing to Trump in next year.
You moved to Oak Park in the year 2000, around the time you met Obama. It's tradition in these sessions for me to ask this of our guests. Why Oak Park?
I was getting married to my first wife. My first wife was African American, and this is Chicago. And you're looking for a place where, you'll be accepted. There won't be issues if you have biracial children where it's racially tolerant. You're going to have a family, so we're moving to the suburbs. So a lot of interracial couples wind up either in Oak Park or Evanston. It's that's a whole nother part of my life that's interesting. As a white male, you usually don't have to make those kinds of choices. There are neighborhoods you certainly don't want to live in, that you don't care that you're excluded from certain neighborhoods. But there are certain places around Chicago that you want to feel comfort that the people around you are not non-judging, accepting of who you are, that you won't send your biracial child to school and have them come home with feeling out of place. So that's the reason I wound up in Oak Park.
David Mendell, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, audience, for being here.
That's journalist David Mendell, author of the first Barack Obama biography, Obama, From Promise to Power. I'm Charlie Meyerson. This has been another Chicago Public Square podcast. More at podcasts.chicagopublicsquare.com.